The morning began quietly in Maplewood, a peaceful town where the air often carried the scent of wet grass and pine. Margaret Hale, a silver-haired woman in her late 60s, stood in her small garden behind the porch, watering her roses just as she did every Sunday. She found comfort in that routine, the sound of water, the soft rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of life waking up around her. Since her husband Henry passed away 7 years ago, these small habits had become her way of staying steady in a world that often felt too silent. She was bending down to trim a few wilted petals when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. She turned, frowning slightly, because she wasn't expecting anyone that morning. A sleek blue car came into view, one she recognized almost immediately. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the young man stepping out. "Ethan," she called out, her voice rising in surprise and joy. Her grandson grinned, slinging a backpack over his shoulder. "Hey, Grandma." He looked taller, stronger than before. The last time she'd seen him was around Christmas, almost 6 months ago. Back then, he'd been a bit lost, still finding his path after college. Now he seemed calmer, though there was a new kind of weight behind his smile, something she couldn't quite read. Margaret hurried to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Oh, my dear boy, what a surprise. You should have called. I would have baked something special." He laughed softly, hugging her back. Then it wouldn't have been a surprise. She pulled back, studying his face. His eyes, gray like his grandfather's, held a gentle warmth, but she could see tiredness there too. "You look like you've been driving all night," she said. "Yeah, I left early. I just wanted to see you." That made her heart ache in the best way. Ethan had always been close to her, even more than most grandsons were. During his childhood, when his parents were going through their endless arguments and eventual divorce, he often spent weekends at her home. She became his safe place, his quiet corner of the world. Now, seeing him again as an adult, she felt both proud and a little nostalgic. "Well, come on in," she said. "Breakfast is still warm." Inside the cozy kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. Margaret poured him a cup and set a plate of pancakes before him. They ate together, chatting about ordinary things, his work at the design firm, his new apartment, his plans for summer. But underneath his easy words, Margaret sensed something unsaid. He laughed at her jokes, asked about her health, but his eyes wandered every now and then as if he was working up the courage to speak. She finally asked, "Gently, Ethan, are you sure everything's all right?" He hesitated, playing with his fork. Yeah, everything's fine. I wanted to spend a few days here. You don't mind, right?" "Of course not," she said, smiling warmly. "This house is always yours." He looked relieved, but still uneasy. She wanted to ask more, but decided to give him time. People, especially young people in love or trouble, often opened up when they were ready, not before. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch together. The rain began to fall gently, drumming against the old wooden roof. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Ethan watched the rain with a faraway look, his elbows resting on his knees. Margaret noticed how grown-up he looked now. Yet how small he seemed in that moment, like the boy who used to come to her with scraped knees and secrets too heavy for his little heart. "Grandma," he said finally, breaking the silence, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. He turned to her, his face serious. "When Grandpa passed away, did you ever think about falling in love again?" Margaret blinked, startled. Of all the things he could have asked, that was the last she expected. "That's quite a question, Ethan," she said with a half-smile. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, his gaze lowering to the floorboards. "I don't know. I was just wondering what it's like to move on, I guess." She looked out at the rain, her mind drifting back through the years. "It wasn't easy," she said quietly. "Henry was my world for a long time. Losing him felt like losing half of myself. After that, I thought I was done with love." "But you weren't, were you?" he asked, eyes searching her face. Margaret's lips curved in a faint, wistful smile. "There was someone, a friend, much later. He used to bring me coffee every morning when I worked at the library. He made me laugh again, but life has a way of reminding us that timing matters. She paused, sighing softly. He moved away for work, and I never saw him again. Ethan didn't say anything at first. Then, slowly, he said, I think I understand that. She glanced at him curiously. Do you now? He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. Yeah, there's someone I care about, Grandma. Someone people don't really understand. Her curiosity deepened, but before she could ask more, Ethan stood up suddenly. I'll tell you later. I just needed to be here for a bit. Margaret watched him walk down the porch steps and stand in the rain, looking lost in thought. She didn't know what was going on in his heart, but she could feel it tip with something big, something that had brought him here not just for comfort, but for guidance. When he came back inside, his hair damp from the rain. She handed him a towel and smiled gently. Whatever it is, Ethan, you don't have to rush. Sometimes the answers come when you stop looking so hard. He smiled faintly. You always know what to say. As night fell, Margaret tucked an extra blanket on the couch for him and sat for a while by the window after he went to sleep. The rain had stopped and the sky was clear again. The moonlight touched the garden softly. She thought about his question about love, about moving on, and realized it still stirred something inside her. Even after all these years, maybe, she thought, love never truly ends. Maybe it simply changes shape. She turned off the lamp and whispered a quiet prayer for her grandson, hoping whatever he was struggling with, he would find peace and the courage to follow his heart. She didn't know yet that his visit was about to bring back pieces of her own past. She thought she'd buried forever. But for now, she was simply glad he was home, outside. The wind moved gently through the roses, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet sense of beginning. The next morning began with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, lighting up the kitchen in a warm glow. Margaret moved around quietly, making breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice just like she used to when Ethan was a boy. He came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, his hair messy, wearing that same sleepy grin she remembered from years ago. Morning, Grandma, he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Morning, dear, she replied with a smile. You always look like you wrestled your dreams all night. He laughed softly and sat at the table. Maybe I did. They ate together in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that felt easy like a soft blanket. But Margaret could sense there was still something sitting on his mind. She watched him push his food around the plate instead of eating, lost in thought. Finally, she said gently, Ethan, you've been quiet since yesterday. You can tell me what's bothering you, you know? He looked up, hesitant, then sighed. I will, Grandma. I just need to find the right words. She didn't press him. Instead, she poured him another cup of coffee and said, then find them over breakfast. Words are easier when there's coffee involved. That made him smile, and for a moment, the tension faded. But as they moved into the living room later that morning, Ethan grew thoughtful again. He started asking her questions about Grandpa Henry, how they met, what their marriage was like, how she knew he was the one. Margaret leaned back on the sofa, smiling faintly as memories filled her mind. We met at a town dance, she said. He stepped on my toes twice and apologized 5 times before the song ended. I married him a year later. Ethan chuckled. Sounds like he knew what he wanted. Oh, he did, she said softly. And I did too. We built a life together, simple, not perfect, but full of love. He had this way of making everything feel steady. Ethan looked at her carefully. You really loved him, didn't you? With all my heart, she said. But love doesn't stop just because someone's gone. It stays, changes form, but it never truly leaves you. He nodded slowly, then looked down at his hands. That's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. Margaret tilted her head, sensing something important coming. Go on, dear. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. There's someone I've been seeing. Someone special. But it's complicated. Margaret's heart stirred with curiosity. Complicated how? He hesitated before answering, his eyes on the floor. She's older than me. A lot older. Margaret didn't speak at first. She could tell how nervous he was, how much courage it took for him to admit that. How much older? She asked softly. About 15 years, he said quickly, then rushed to add. But it's not like what people think. She's not trying to control me or anything. We just understand each other. She listens. She sees me in a way no one else does. Margaret stayed silent for a moment, studying his face. He wasn't defensive or ashamed, just uncertain, afraid of being judged. She remembered that feeling well. Does she make you happy? She asked finally. Ethan looked up, surprised. Yes, more than anyone ever has. Then that's what matters, she said gently. Not what people say. Real love is rare, Ethan. If it's honest and kind, don't let fear ruin it. He stared at her, eyes wide. You really think that? She nodded, her expression calm but full of emotion. I do. Love doesn't follow a calendar. It finds us when it wants to. He leaned back, exhaling in relief. I didn't think you'd understand. Margaret smiled faintly. Oh, I understand more than you think. He looked curious. You mean? You've been in a situation like that? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. After your grandfather passed, I met someone. His name was David. He was younger by almost 10 years. He used to come to the library to read. We talked every week about books, life, little things. He had a warmth about him, a kindness I hadn't felt in years. Ethan listened quietly, his eyes soft with empathy. One day, she continued, her voice low, he asked me to have dinner with him. I almost said no, I was afraid of what people would say. But something inside me told me to go. And for a while, I felt alive again. We never made it official. He got a job offer in Boston and left. We wrote for a few months, but eventually, life moved on. Her voice faded, and a bittersweet silence filled the room. I guess, she said, looking at Ethan with a tender smile, I was too scared to hold on to something that made me happy. Maybe I shouldn't have been. Ethan's throat tightened. Grandma. She reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Don't repeat my mistake, Ethan. If she's good to you, if it's real, then don't let the world's opinions stop you. People love to talk, but they don't live your life. He swallowed hard, his eyes shining. That's exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time since he arrived, Ethan looked at peace. Margaret could see the change in his face, like a heavy weight had been lifted. He smiled softly, almost shyly. There's something else, he said. I've been thinking about asking her to marry me. Margaret blinked, surprised. Marriage. He nodded. Yeah, I know it's soon. We've been together for about a year. But she's everything. She's kind, grounded, and she makes me feel like I'm enough. I've never felt that before. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She saw herself in him, not the young boy she once knew, but a man brave enough to love with his whole heart. Then you should tell her, she said quietly. Life's too short to hold back from love. If it's meant to be, you'll know. Ethan smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. I'm glad I came here. I didn't know what I'd say, but I needed to hear that from you. Margaret brushed a tear from her cheek and laughed softly. You came here for my advice, but I think you've reminded me of something too. What's that? He asked. That it's never too late to believe in love again, she said with a wistful smile. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You still can, Grandma. Maybe you should. She laughed softly, shaking her head. One miracle at a time, dear. They sat there for a while longer, the sun now golden through the windows, casting a warm glow on both their faces. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the garden sparkled with drops of light. For the first time in years, Margaret felt her heart open again, not for the past, but for the beauty of love itself, the kind that refuses to die no matter how old you get. And for Ethan. That morning became a turning point, a quiet moment of truth that gave him the strength to follow his heart without fear. What neither of them knew yet was that this conversation would soon lead to a choice that would change both their lives forever. That evening, The air in Maplewood felt heavy with the promise of rain again. The sky was painted gray, and a soft wind rustled through the trees as if the world itself was holding its breath. Margaret sat by the window, knitting slowly, though her mind wasn't on the yarn. Her thoughts kept circling back to Ethan's words from earlier, the confession about his relationship. His plans to marry, and the courage it must have taken for him to say it out loud. She couldn't help but admire him. In a world where so many people gave up on love because of fear or judgment, Ethan was daring to hold on to it. It reminded her of something she'd lost long ago, the bravery to believe love could still be possible no matter the odds. Ethan entered the living room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might like one," he said with a small smile. She looked up, grateful. "You still remember how I like it?" 2 spoons of sugar and a hint of milk, he replied proudly. She chuckled. Good memory. They sat together in silence for a moment, sipping tea, watching raindrops trickle down the glass. The house was calm, the kind of calm that carried both comfort and meaning. Margaret could sense something else weighing on him, something he hadn't yet said. "You've been quiet again," she said softly. "Still thinking about her?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I can't stop. She doesn't even know I came here. I just needed to be sure before I do what I'm planning." Margaret turned to him, sensing the intensity in his voice. "And what is it you're planning, dear?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. Margaret froze for a moment, her heart catching in her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, "is that?" He nodded, opening the box to reveal a delicate silver ring with a tiny blue sapphire in the center. "I bought it 2 weeks ago," he said quietly. "I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure if it was right. Everyone around me keeps saying I'm making a mistake. That she's too old for me, that it won't work, that I'll regret it someday." He looked up at her with eyes full of doubt and longing. "But Grandma, when I'm with her, I feel at peace. I feel like I'm home." Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at him, the same boy who once came to her crying after losing his first pet. The same young man who had always searched for meaning in everything, and now here he was, standing on the edge of one of life's biggest choices. She took a slow breath and set down her teacup. "Ethan," she said gently, "let me tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age." He nodded, waiting. "When love is real, it doesn't ask for permission," she said. "It doesn't check ages or compare backgrounds. It simply finds you and stays. People will always talk, they'll always have something to say, but they won't be there in the quiet moments, the mornings, the laughter, or the heartbreaks. You will. So don't live for their approval. Live for what brings you peace." Ethan's eyes glistened as he listened. "But how do you know if it's real?" he asked softly. She smiled sadly. "Because it doesn't fade when things get hard. Real love doesn't run, it endures. That's how I knew your grandfather was the one. And that's how I knew, even after he was gone, that love doesn't die, changes shape, but it stays." Her words seemed to sink deep into him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping gently on the window. Then Ethan closed the box carefully and looked at her again. "I needed to hear that," he said. "I guess I just wanted to know you'd understand." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. "Of course, I understand. More than anyone else ever could." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You know, Grandma, you're the only person I trust with this. I didn't even tell Mom or Dad." "Sometimes," she said softly, "the heart needs quiet counsel, not noise." They both laughed gently, and for a brief moment the weight of everything seemed to lift. But then Ethan's face grew serious again. "There's one more thing," he said. Margaret's brow furrowed. "What is it?" He hesitated. "She doesn't believe I'll actually propose. She thinks I'll listen to everyone else and walk away. I think she's scared too. That's why I came here. I wanted to be sure I wasn't just chasing something foolish." Margaret shook her head. "Ethan, if she brings you peace, then it's not foolish. It's brave. And the world could use more brave love." He smiled at her words, a small tear forming in his eye. "You sound like Grandpa," he said quietly. Her heart warmed. Then I must be saying the right thing. It's for the next hour. They talked, truly talked. About love, fear, and all the things that make life worth living. Margaret shared memories she hadn't spoken of in years. The first time Henry told her he loved her. The nights they stayed up dreaming about the future, the way he'd make her laugh even when they had nothing. Ethan listened like someone hearing a long-lost melody. You loved him deeply. Ethan said finally. I did, she whispered. But love doesn't stop at the grave. It stays waiting quietly inside us, ready to be found again if we let it. He looked at her with admiration. You really believe that? She smiled softly. I do. And maybe, just maybe, you being here is the universe's way of reminding me. Ethan laughed gently, shaking his head. You always make everything sound like a story. That's because every love is one, she said, her eyes kind. Some just end sooner than others. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the night sky clear and full of stars. Ethan stood and looked out the window. You know what? He said after a pause. I'm going to do it. I'm going to ask her. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. Then go, my dear boy. Tell her how you feel. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Make it. He turned to her, his eyes bright and full of determination. Will you give me your blessing, Grandma? The morning light broke through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the living room floor. Margaret woke early, as she always did, and began brewing coffee. The house was quiet, but there was a warmth in the silence, a sense that something good was waiting to happen. She thought about Ethan, about the ring he had shown her, and about the bravery in his eyes when he finally decided to follow his heart. It reminded her of the same courage her late husband Henry had once carried, the quiet, steadfast kind that built families and changed lives. She was stirring her coffee when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan stood there, dressed neatly in a pale blue shirt, his hair brushed, his expression calm but nervous. Morning, Grandma, he said softly. Morning, dear, she replied with a knowing smile. You didn't sleep much, did you? He laughed under his breath. Not really. I kept thinking about what you said last night. About love not asking for permission. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it over. Well, it's true. Love doesn't wait for perfect timing. It just needs honest hearts. He nodded, his fingers brushing the rim of the cup. I'm going to see her today, he said. I'm going to ask her. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride and a trace of worry. Then go with a clear mind and an open heart. And remember, you don't need to convince the world, just her. He took a deep breath, nodded again, and smiled. Wish me luck. Always, she said, touching his arm gently. You have more than luck, you have love on your side. A few hours later, the house felt strangely quiet without him. Margaret sat on the porch, wrapped in a light shawl, staring at the garden. The roses were blooming again, their colors brighter than she remembered. She thought of Ethan as a boy, chasing butterflies between those same rose bushes. And now he was a man standing on the edge of his future. Time, she thought, was such a strange thing. It carried people forward whether they were ready or not. And yet it somehow brought them back too, just like Ethan had returned to her doorstep, searching for wisdom, for love's permission. The afternoon drifted by slowly. The clock ticked. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. Margaret tried reading a book, but her eyes kept glancing toward the road. Every sound, a car, a distant bark. A gust of wind made her heart flutter with anticipation. Then, just as the sun began to set, she heard the sound of tires on gravel. She looked up quickly, and there it was, the same blue car pulling into the driveway. Her pulse quickened. Ethan stepped out, and before she could even ask, she saw the answer written all over his face. His smile was wide, almost glowing. She said yes, he said simply. Walking toward her. Margaret's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. She stood up, her hand covering her mouth. Oh, Ethan. He wrapped her in a tight hug, laughing softly. She said yes, Grandma. She couldn't believe it at first. But when I told her I loved her and that I wasn't afraid anymore, she just started crying. Then she said yes. Margaret held him close, feeling her heart swell with a happiness she hadn't felt in years. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You listened to your heart." He pulled back and smiled, his eyes shining. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the courage to follow what's real." They sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret couldn't stop smiling. "Tell me about her," she said. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "Her name's Laura. She teaches art at the university. She's funny, stubborn, and she makes the best coffee I've ever had. We met by accident, literally. I spilled a drink on her at a cafe, and she laughed instead of getting angry. I think I fell for her right there." Margaret chuckled softly. "Sounds like fate had a hand in it." "Maybe it did," he said, smiling. "She told me she didn't think I was serious because of what everyone else said. But when I told her about you, how you believed in love, no matter the age or the rules, she said she wanted to meet you one day." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. "I'd love that, dear. I'd love to meet the woman who made you this happy." Ethan looked out at the sunset, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Grandma, I think Grandpa would have liked her too." Margaret smiled softly, her heart aching with bittersweet joy. "I think so too. He always believed love was the one thing worth fighting for." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. The world around them seemed to slow down. The crickets began to sing. The air cooled and the first stars began to appear above. Ethan turned to her suddenly. "Can I tell you something else?" "Of course," she said. "I told Laura about the story you shared about the man who made you laugh again after Grandpa passed away. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. She said maybe you should try finding him again if he's still out there." Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, I wouldn't know where to start. It's been years." "Maybe that's what makes it worth trying," Ethan said with a playful grin. "You never know what could happen." She smiled, her eyes glimmering with warmth. "You sound like me 30 years ago." "Maybe that's where I get it from," he said with a wink. They both laughed quietly. And for a moment, the world felt light again. The kind of lightness that comes when you finally let go of old fears and open your heart to the present. As the evening deepened, Ethan stood up. "I should probably head back soon. Laura's waiting for me." Margaret nodded, standing too. "Go to her and promise me something, anything." "Take care of her heart," she said softly. "It's the most fragile and powerful thing in the world." "I will," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll tell her she already has your blessing." He hugged her again, tight and full of love. Then he stepped into his car and waved one last time before driving off into the fading light. Margaret stood on the porch long after he was gone, her heart full and her eyes glistening. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel empty, it felt peaceful. She looked toward the old oak tree in the yard, the one she and Henry had carved their initials into decades ago. The carving had faded, but the memory remained, just like love itself, soft, enduring, unbroken. A cool breeze brushed her face, and she closed her eyes, whispering to the wind, "Maybe love never really ends. It just changes hands." The stars shimmered above, and somewhere in that moment, Margaret felt a gentle warmth, like an unseen hand resting on her shoulder. She smiled, believing it was Henry smiling too. As she walked back inside, she glanced once more at the glowing night sky. Her grandson had found his love. Her heart had found peace. And the house once lonely was full of quiet joy again. Love had come full circle. And as the clock ticked softly in the corner, Margaret whispered to herself, "It's never too late to believe in love again."